Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
How you guys doing? It's Darren. Welcome to the Touch MBA podcast. I have a dandy of an episode. Is dandy even a word? I don't know, but this is a really, really good one. I spoke with my friend Rahul, who is currently attending Insead. Rahul started in January and will graduate this December. But I think what you'll really get from this episode is just a really good idea of what the Insead experience is like. We focused our conversation on his leadership. He's the president of the private equity club, I should say private equity and venture capital student club at Insead. And I wanted to get a better idea of what it's like to lead a student club at Insead. But we also talked about private equity and venture capital opportunities at a school like Insead, what you need to do to get your foot in the door there. We also discussed entrepreneurship at Insead, of course, and Rahul and I just really go through his experience. So you have a really good idea of, for example, if you want to do an exchange at Wharton, or you want to do an exchange at Kellogg, what that requires. If you want to get into certain classes, what that requires. There's actually a bidding system. How the social dynamics are different on the Fountainebleu campus or the Singapore campus. So just lots of great real-time student insights in this podcast. We were only planning to speak for 30 minutes, but it turned into over an hour conversation that I think a lot of you will benefit from. Rahul's a straight shooter, and I know you're going to enjoy this one. Also, remember that we give free school selection help at touchmba.com. That's right, we have a website and we specialize in school selection. So if you need help figuring out which programs you're competitive at, which programs might fit you best, and want some pointers on how you can strengthen your application, go check us out. Go get some free help at touchmba.com. Now, on to my chat with Rahul. I'm really excited to have our next guest on the show. He's a friend I've known for many years. We used to play basketball together, actually, and had a love for hip hop too. I remember that. But it's my pleasure to introduce Rahul Kewalramani to the show. Rahul is an Insead student currently, and I just had to pick his brain on the experience. Rahul, thank you for waking up this early and being on the Touch MBA podcast.
Not a problem. Hey, everyone. Hey, Darren. You got my last name perfectly. That was really good.
But not the first, right?
No, that was okay. That was okay, too. But the last name, usually people butcher. So you did a good job.
So, Rahul, would you mind just giving a quick introduction of yourself? You know, what you were doing before Insead and what you're doing now and what you hope to do in the future.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess the bulk of my professional career prior to Insead was in investment banking. After a short stint in consulting in San Fran post-undergrad, I came to Singapore with JP Morgan. I was with them for 5 years covering Southeast Asia, so M&A, capital markets, transactions. In between JP Morgan and Macquarie Capital, I had a short stint helping my dad scrapping ships in Papua New Guinea, but it's perhaps a story for another time. But yeah, after JP Morgan, was with Macquarie for a year, focusing on tech. Post-banking, I had a pretty interesting role. I moved to a startup called Redmart. Redmart, for folks who might be in New York or anywhere on the East Coast, is very similar to Fresh Direct. It's an online grocer. So I joined Redmart 2 years before school as head of corporate development, which pretty much meant in-house banker taking care of fundraising, as well as corporate finance, so, financial modeling, strategy, coordinating the executive committee on our business plan, and building out the financial planning and analysis team, or the FP&A team. Yeah, so that was my career prior to Insead. The founders of Redmart were Insead alum. A bunch of friends are from Insead. I heard great things about the program, so I made the transition in Jan. I started in Jan 2016, so that makes me 16D, as we call it, which is someone who's going to graduate in December, and 16 is for the year you graduate. And in short, the reason behind the MBA was I was looking for a couple of things. I was looking for a career transition to the buy side. That's number one. Number two, I felt it was a good 1 year. Let's be frank, it's a bit of a change of pace. You can call it a break perhaps, but a 1 year sort of change of pace from professional life and opportunity to live in Europe, which I've never done before.
So you want to transition to the buy side, but do you want to get back into finance then, or?
Yeah, great question, because the buy side's quite diverse, right? So most people think buy side private equity. I mean, that's the most probably high profile or well known sort of sector within buy side. At Redmart, I was dealing with venture capital investors. So I sat across the table from VC investors or sometimes growth capital investors. Growth capital is a term given for anyone who's sort of interested in companies that are a bit too young for PE and a bit too old to be considered venture capital. They're kind of like Deliveroo a year ago. Are you familiar with Deliveroo?
I'm not. Deliveroo.
Yeah. Deliveroo is like a restaurant delivery service, or perhaps you could say Uber 4 years ago or 3 years ago.
Right.
So, proven model, very, very popular, close to or on the path to profitability, and perhaps in need of money to expand globally. That's kind of growth capital.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I'm interested in that. I won't lie, and aspiring students should know that you don't have to know exactly what you're going to do, and most students don't. So I won't lie in saying that I'm looking at other things as well, including asset management, perhaps a bit more of a stable lifestyle, but still involved in, valuing companies, which is what I did when I was at JP Morgan, but mostly public company focused. And then part of me is definitely tinkering with entrepreneurial sort of ideas, which Darren, I should speak to you about afterwards because you will have a lot of good insight.
So you're not planning on scrapping any more ships?
No more ships. I mean, I will say I'm a bit spoiled for living in a jungle in Papua New Guinea, which is what we were doing back then.
Yeah.
But I need something a bit more modern.
Yeah, because I remember that was actually when we started our kind of MBA discussion, right? That's when you were actually thinking of getting one, right? So it's been quite a while. So you had that stint at Redmart, and then you decided to apply.
Yeah, I mean, I actually did apply for schools that year in between the two banks. I probably rookie mistake. I waited a bit long, and I only applied to like the top two schools I wanted to go to.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So frankly, things didn't work out there. And then I came across the Redmart opportunity, which definitely kept me interested and focused on that career.
Yeah.
It was a great company. It is a great company, and it was a great job based here in Singapore. Yeah. But 2 years there and getting a couple of deals under my belt and speaking with the founders and friends, the MBA itch was still there.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk to you about your nice title, which is that you're president of the Insead Private Equity and Venture Capital Club. I've had a couple podcast guests from Insead on the show, but they were mostly on the admissions side.
Right.
And so I'm just curious to learn more about the student experience. And, since we're friends, I thought this would be a really, nice, easy episode. But the idea of like clubs at Insead, we hear a lot about student clubs at especially the top US schools. But I was curious what it's like in such an accelerated program, in a European program, in such a global program, kind of the importance of clubs in the experience and, how involved they are.
Yeah, I mean, the way you phrase the question is great. It really is a distinction to make that it's a club in a very accelerated program. So let's see, where should I start? The Insead curriculum or the Insead MBA does have a lot of clubs to offer students. There's the PE and VC club. There's the banking club. There's a consulting club. So the typical sort of industries that are hot. Then there's the entrepreneurship club. And there's many clubs that are academic or career focused. And there's a lot of fun clubs. So there, and I was part of the basketball club as well. And that was a lot of fun. And There's a skiing club and a host of clubs, and they're fun. But I guess the thing to highlight is it is an accelerated program. So the clubs sort of are there, like they fill up. There's a lot of time to spend on clubs, but they compete for time, your time, your academic time or your social time. So spending I just spent an exchange period at Wharton, which we can get into later, but over there, the experience is totally different. Students have 2 years. There's maybe 6 times the number of clubs, and it's very much a common feature of your day. At Insead, you need to be selective. You need to be focused on what you're interested in. And at the end of the day, at any school, it's a great way for you to meet people, learn more about an industry that you're targeting, and spend interesting time outside of the classroom. So that's from the student perspective. Maybe I'll jump into your initial question, what it's like to lead the club.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's a really nice way to give back. Bottom line, several students come from various backgrounds. A lot of engineers, for example, interested in banking or interested in private equity or venture capital, which my club focuses on. So they often come up to you. They know who you are because you're on the website or you're announced as part of emails. And they come with simple questions or looking for guidance for how to get jobs. And you can see you really have an impact. Like, especially with venture capital, my network here in Singapore and Southeast Asia is huge. I built a network in Europe through a couple of conferences we hold, which I'll jump into as well. So I think it's been really nice for me to see that I've been able to help other students. That's the number one benefit and number one thing I've gotten out of it. Yeah, I guess, sorry if I just interrupted you, I guess a couple more things to take note of. It is a position of power in a funny way. So you can't joke around with it. It's 10 months and you're the contact for alumni who are in those fields looking for students. So they'll reach out to you. Yeah. So, I'll get emails often. Or by the way, it's me and a co-president in the other campus. And then there's a host of VPs in charge of different things. So we as a group will get emails or we'll hear of things, and we have to be careful and think about this wider student body and make sure the club members get access to it soon or resources are shared. So in that sense, you got to be on top of your game and making sure that you're not ignoring the club. It does take a lot of time. It does take effort, and you want to do a good job for all the students.
Yeah. So could you talk to us more about those conferences, which seem to be kind of the big activity of your club? Yeah.
So unique compared to other Insead clubs is that the PE and VC club throw conferences every year. So there's one conference hosted by the 16J, or let me say the June graduating cohort that's held in May in Fountainebleu. And there's another conference by the December graduating cohort held in November. So in 3 days there in Singapore. This is why I was kind of hard to get a hold of earlier.
Now you tell me on the podcast.
Yes. So these conferences are industry conferences where you bring really awesome professionals, partners, MDs, anyone doing cool things in the sector to campus, onto panels, and a bit of a, networking, knowledge sharing platform where students and alumni come, they buy tickets to attend the event, they hear these really interesting panels, and then they have a networking session as well. And these panels range, right? So in PE and VC, there's many different things to talk about. So let me give you an example of what's happening in the Singapore conference. We have a panel on value creation. So PE professionals, when they buy a company and you do all the financial savviness with leverage and all that sort of stuff, that's all good. But on the other side, you have to operate the company and you have to find ways of creating value. Yeah. So there are professionals in private equity who are all about value creation. So we have a panel about that. We have a panel about doing deals and finding opportunities and getting them done, getting the acquisition done in Southeast Asia, which is very tricky because you have family-run businesses for generations and generations who don't want to deal with the modern private equity shop. You have tricky sort of political situations in certain countries at various times. You have fast-growing nations, but low GDP. So how do you make it work? It's not easy to buy into an investment thesis in Southeast Asia, especially when your investment committee is back in New York. So that's one panel. Then we have another panel on venture capital, obviously the hottest thing the last couple of years with the growth of Uber and Airbnb and the like. So we have and this is actually a panel I was in charge of, besides kind of managing the overall conference. My contacts really came through, and we have a great set of managing partners at some of Southeast Asia's best venture capital firms.
So it's a very student-led sort of activity.
Yeah. So on the organization, 100% student-led. Insead hosts the largest student-led conference in Europe and Asia. We have 300. This year is the first sold-out conference, I'm proud to say.
Oh, congrats, man. Yeah.
300 attendees, 35 panelists. These conferences, to be clear, are also held by some of the other top schools in the U.S., but those are obviously U.S.-centric, based in the U.S. So Wharton's is coming up. I think it's later on in January. Harvard does the same. So those two schools do it as well. But yeah, Insead, similar model, student-led, alumni supported in terms of attendees, panelists. Alumni love to give back in this sort of way. And that's sort of what the conference is about.
And so, how many actual members are in the private equity venture capital club? It's one club, right? Or is it two? Yeah,
clubs? It's one club. It's one club, and
it's a bit confusing.
Yeah, I hear you. It is, because VC's kind of been a new thing for the last couple of years.
Got it.
So that's why actually the club's name, the legacy name is IPEC. It's Insead Private Equity Club.
Yep.
The IPEC Club, when we talk about it, on, for example, this podcast, when I describe it to people or when I describe a conference, we always say PE and VC, because VC is a big feature and a big function, and Insead's done a good job of making sure VC is prevalent in the club. Club members, roughly out of a 500 member student body, we have about 200 members. So it is the largest club at Insead.
Oh, wow.
Because if you think about it, it attracts your corporate finance folks who are interested in banking, consulting, or PE. It attracts your entrepreneurs who are interested in venture capital. And it attracts consultants who are interested in value creation. So
it's like the perfect triple circle Venn diagram.
yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah, it really is. And unfortunately, getting a job in that perfect triple circle Venn diagram is a much tougher thing. But yeah, it's I would say, if I remember correctly, I think it's about 180 students roughly in the 16D cohort.
Got it. And I want to ask you about those jobs, but one more question is, in terms of the different graduating classes, right? Like graduating in J or D, like June, right? Or December. How does that work in terms of the clubs, right? Because I'm assuming there's one club for both cohorts, right?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, you're right. It's a great question. And that's why the trickiness with the accelerated program is that the handover is very rapid. It has to be taken very seriously, and happens depending on which cohort you are at different times. So if I'm getting too confusing, let me know. But the J's, for example, who were there before me, they took the club in November 15, and they were running the club until they handed it over to us in June 16.
Yep.
Their conference was in May, so they had 5 months to prepare for the conference. We take it in June 16. Then we have this sudden break of the 2 months summer. Then we have 2 short months, September, October, and then our conference is right away in November because we're graduating in December.
Yeah.
We really only have the club for 2.5 months before we throw the conference, so it's a shorter time period than the folks who are doing the conference in Fonte. And then soon after this club happens, this Friday, the conference happens this Friday. I mean, the deadlines for the new J's to submit the application to be the leadership of the club takes place, and we have to quickly do the handover.
Got it.
So the guy the team who was in charge before me and my co-president took over, one specific guy, Pedro, he was very aware of this fact, and he was very helpful in, a lot of one-on-one meetings on what's been happening, how do we take over, what have students been interested in, that sort of thing. And we'll have to do the same with the guys who take over for us.
Cool. And you're elected to all those positions, whether it's president or VP of this?
Correct.
Yep. Okay.
Correct. We're elected by the old leadership.
Oh.
As well as the career center. So the Career Center at INSEAD and the old leadership and the Career Center go through all the team applications. Keep in mind, it's not like, well, it depends on how you want to run it, but traditionally the existing leadership conveys to students, please apply with your team assembled pretty much, as opposed to applying one-off, hey, I'm interested in president, I'm interested in VP.
Right.
So you have to do a lot. If you're part of a new cohort, you got to do a lot of communication with your own student body and your own friends and professionals in your own cohort about, hey, I'm trying to put together a team. I'm keen on this role. Are you keen? You have this background. You do a really good job. So there's a lot of work being done by Shiv and myself, my co-president, in figuring out who could fit the team well, who's keen, who's actually motivated. Let's be honest, there are always people who may be just interested in the title and not as motivated, so you have to be kind of careful about that.
Yep.
But yeah, so you put together a team and then you apply. So there's only maybe, I think when we won, there were 4 teams that applied.
Wow. So you have some election experience in this election year. Yes. Hopefully you're not pulling any Trump or Hillary tactics, but awesome.
Yeah, no, much cleaner. not too much of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's move on then that's a really interesting insight into how the clubs are run. And I assume, they're all slightly different, but kind of similar, right? In that sense.
And how they're run and how they're elected.
Yeah.
Similar.
Let's first talk about jobs. As you said, it's tougher, right, to land jobs in these industries. They're very hot MBA industries too, right? So it's not just pure competition from the outside world, corporate world, but also all these talented, smart, ambitious MBAs going for these gigs. Mm-hmm. So what would you suggest in terms of people who are interested in, I know they're separate kind of things, but private equity, venture capital, growth capital, to get their foot in the door in these sort of industries? Do they really need to come from a banking background like you have with JP Morgan, or how can someone break into the industry?
Sure. So I'll quickly on the background. It's not a prerequisite to be a banker or an ex-private equity professional. There are good skills that are very transferable, but I think the business school program and a little bit of your own even sort of research and reading and studying will get you up to speed on the basics of corporate finance, or why leverage makes an acquisition make sense, what an IRR is and what the returns are. There's so many resources out there, and trying to do the typical modeling that you'll get tested on during an interview. So while banking and the like may help, it's not a prerequisite. So then going on to sort of, you're asking about how does one go about it? So yes, there are companies that regularly recruit on campus, and these are your bigger private equity shops. And by the way, I'll sometimes quickly jump to VC because the two sectors are very different. Yeah. So now I'm describing PE. So there are your large private equity shops, for example, KKR or TPG or Carlyle, who quite regularly will try to get 1 or 2 associates from their top schools. So INSEAD, Wharton, Harvard, as I mentioned before, they will have those sort of job postings, and you go through your regular career center on campus and apply on the deadline, go through on-campus recruitment, that sort of thing. But definitely, depending on the school you go to, that can be very tricky and very few opportunities that way. So no doubt in my mind, if you're at INSEAD and you want to go through, and you're interested in private equity, you got to put in a lot of effort through an enterprise search, as they call it, where you do it on your own. You reach out to people on your own. INSEAD has a lot of great avenues of alumni coming to school, or the conference, or alumni network directory being obviously everyone has access to that if you're a student. And generally, alumni have been quite responsive to, for example, my emails on the growth capital side. But you need to put in that effort, get in touch with them, try to meet them when you're in London, try to meet them when you're in Singapore or Hong Kong, and build a relationship. That's the number one way to get into these sectors, in my opinion. Maybe I should jump into why it's so selective or why it's sort of tough. I mean, if you think about it right there, and it's these big companies are managing funds. These funds have billions of dollars, but they have their criteria for a deal. So a typical deal for KKR, for example, in Asia might be $300 million and up. You don't need an army of people if you're managing single-digit billions or even double-digit billions to do 4 deals a year.
Right.
Right. So that's why these are relatively small teams, and it's very selective. It's very opportunistic in that way. As and when a position opens up, they'll do a lateral hire. As and when the team is maturing and getting promoted, they'll come on campus to get an associate, or for undergrads. Well, sorry, I take that back. Undergrads and analysts are not common at all. But yeah, on the associate side. So that's PE and sort of why PE is a bit tough and tricky. Venture capital, what I said about the funds is a similar thing. Smaller fund sizes, typical VC firm in Asia is 100 to 300 million. In the US and in the Valley, it might be 500 to a couple of billion. But it's a lean business model where it's about investing into companies. You don't need a whole team of people. Also, venture capital is an additional sort of complexity. You really need people who are enthusiastic about startups and if it's a tech-focused fund, technology, because it's not like private equity where you're buying into a company that's been around for 30 to 40 years and you can do a discounted cash flow, or you can do a comparable valuation using public comps of companies that are similar in the public markets. You're working with much less information and you're working with less quantitative information. So you really need to be passionate about a certain sort of technology. Let's say it's artificial intelligence. You really need to know who the players are. And that's sort of what makes VC a bit tough. And you also have to have a long-term horizon. Not every student wants to be in a post-graduation career where you're going to see the upside only after 7 years. So that's VC for you. Growth capital is somewhere in between. And in my personal view, the most interesting, because these companies are there, they are profitable, or they're about to be profitable, they're larger in size. There's a little bit of entrepreneurship angle to it, and you're trying to assess management team or the promise of a proven business model in the US, whether it'll work in Asia, but you're not working with a company that started 2 years ago and has no data to work off of.
Yeah. Oh no, that's a great backdrop. So would you say though that like Insead's network is stronger here in these two sectors, if you could call them that, in Europe and Asia, as opposed to the US?
100%.
Yeah. Okay.
100%. Yeah. I mean, we have a lot. I mean, just by nature, I mean, geography definitely plays a role here. We've been in France for years and for decades, and a lot of our alumni are in Europe, Germany, France, London. Besides alumni, the recruiting partners, the HR recruiting partners from these big firms, they're looking for the top schools, and INSEAD's obviously in that list. Yeah. So they'll come to INSEAD.
And that list is really short, right? I mean, we're talking about, I mean, just, because I want our listeners to hear this, that, yeah, they can maybe reach out to their personal contacts, right? Like try to grow their network individually. But in terms of school recruiting, would you say that's like a handful of programs? Like we're talking about, the big names.
Yes, for sure. And admittedly, in my opinion, INSEAD should be doing a much better job there too. Yeah. Like we don't get everything. Actually, which reminds me, I missed out on this point earlier when I was speaking about the clubs. One of the big responsibilities of the club, and it started as a goal and a desire by students, and it's definitely a responsibility, is to improve our profile in this sector and get more jobs. But yeah, the list is short. So, INSEAD has been in top 3 schools around the world by the Financial Times for years and years. We were ranked number 1 earlier this year. It's always in every top 10 ranking. So INSEAD's, of course, there. The other good schools that are often featured or who, to jump to your point directly, who get a lot of the job postings for these firms is London Business School.
Interesting.
London Business School is in London. You're able to do part-time work while you're studying in your site. It's a longer program, so the second year you can work while you're studying as well. You just have the access is a very key point there.
Interesting. And then in the US, which schools would you say?
So again, focusing on this finance sector, VC and PE, right?
Yeah.
On the PE side, definitely Wharton. Wharton is a finance powerhouse.
Yeah.
Some of the names of people I saw on the directory, on the Wharton alumni directory, while I was there and had access to it, is really incredible. And then you definitely have Harvard, and you definitely have Stanford. Stanford's also really well known for being in Silicon Valley, tech, entrepreneurship, growth capital, venture capital. So those three are probably top three in my limited knowledge, given I didn't go to these schools. And then, I think schools like Columbia, based in New York, MIT, with its legacy when it comes to the the entrepreneurial sort of sector, they do pretty well in terms of the recruitment opportunities.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. It's almost like taking a step back, and what I get from your answers is looking, depending on what industry you're targeting, really looking at which geographies are strong, as well as obviously, which schools will have kind of an enduring, lasting reputation as a way to kind 100%. Of narrow down. Those seem to be the two factors. Could you explain to our listeners the difference between the D's and the J's?
Yeah, no problem.
And which options they should maybe consider.
Yep, no problem. So just from the outset, the D's are students who start in January and graduate in December. Hence, they're called the D's. And then typically you refer to them with the graduating year. So I am a 16D. I'm going to graduate in December 2016, which is right around the corner.
Yeah.
Yeah, really crazy. This year's flown by. And the J's are those who start in September and graduate in June.
Right.
The key difference between these two, so both of them, so Insead is officially a 10-month program. You have 5 periods of 2 months each, P1, P2, etc. till P5. But the difference is for the December cohort, my cohort is there's a summer period in between. There's a summer break in between these 5 periods. And the summer break happens in July and August. This obviously is quite important for folks who are trying to make a career transition, and they have the opportunity to do an internship in the new targeted industry they're trying to get into.
So could we walk through, for example, your journey? Like, where were you? The first 2 periods. Were you the 3rd period? Where were you the 4th period? Where will you be the 5th period? Just so our listeners kind of understand how that all works logistically.
Yeah, no problem. And the first 2 periods, as you mentioned, as you lump them together, is indeed the core classes period. So that's the period where you do your core classes. Everyone has to do those periods. You do them with the same set of people. So a student body of 500 is roughly 300 in France and 200 in Singapore to start off. The 300 in France is broken up into sections of 75. So you have 4 sections. And those core classes in P1, P2, you do it with the same section mates. It's the same people for the first 4 months. And that's also naturally where you end up forming your strongest friendships and, friendships for life. So I did those in France, P1 and P2, January, February, March, and April. P3 is the first period where students are allowed to do exchanges between the 2 campuses, Singapore and France. Let me highlight for our listeners that these 2 campuses are totally equal to each other in every respect.
Okay.
One is small. Yeah, one is smaller than the other, not because it's a sister or not because it's a junior or anything like that, purely because of capacity constraints. Singapore was built later than France. It was built, actually, shame to say I don't know the exact year, but I want to say maybe a decade or a little bit more than a decade ago. And over time, the interesting thing is Singapore has become more and more popular because of the strength of the Southeast Asian markets. Singapore, as you know, Darren, a lot of folks with very ambitious with career ambitions will come to Singapore. You have all careers over here. It's a modern city, first world city, near Hong Kong, etc. So yeah, Singapore is an equal campus in every way. In P3, folks will go from Singapore to France and vice versa. So that's the first period you can do exchanges. I did my P3. I stayed in France. Pretty much. I mean, this is very personal, very, very unique to me, and based on my background. I lived in Singapore for 8 years. Yeah. I know the city well. I love Singapore, but I was looking for that, 1 year out or a bit of time away from Singapore. So I was enjoying the baguettes and cheese and wine in the small town of France. And that's when the weather starts getting warmer. And it's a small town, but it's a beautiful small town. There's a lot to complain about it in terms of, on Monday, certain restaurants are not open. A lot of businesses are not open because it's a small town. But at the same time, you're in a forest. The runs we had through the forest were amazing there. And
yeah.
So it's quaint and nice. And I enjoyed my P3 there.
I mean, would you say, just a quick question, would you say that it's easier to get to know your classmates in that sort of environment? Or would you say it's about the same?
This is a long-standing debate among students, man. It's so interesting what people will say. And I'm happy to try to jump into that a little bit.
Yes, please.
So students in France, and the bottom line, let me preface this by saying everyone is biased towards wherever they started. Everyone will say their location was better. So in France, you get pretty close to those that you live with. A lot of people live in big houses of 10 people, these old school, really cool French maisons, as they call it, or in castles. There are actually 5 or 6 legit castles around the forest that you would need a car to go to school, go to and from school, maybe 10 minutes drive. And then because of that, you're kind of stuck, or you're sort of, it's conducive to getting to know your other 10 or 16 flatmates that live in the castle with you. So I think groups form around kind of who you live nearby, as well as who you interact with, mostly in your classes or in your clubs or in your sports.
Yeah.
In Singapore, you all live, most people, 90% live in these 2 buildings or 3 buildings that are nearby campus. Dover and Heritage, I believe it's by the Buena Vista MRT. It's 1 or 2 stops from campus. And everyone seemed to be a lot more close with everyone as opposed to smaller groups.
Interesting. Yeah.
The funny impact of technology here, WhatsApp groups have a limit of 250. So every single person in Singapore was on the same WhatsApp group. While in Fonty, I was in the same WhatsApp group as my section mates. I was in section 9. I had a basketball WhatsApp group. I had a house WhatsApp group. I had a bunch of buddies. The crew of guys I hung out with, we had a WhatsApp group. So there already you can see the difference.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I never knew that how that worked. Man, WhatsApp. Yeah, these chat apps must be just blowing up all the time as an MBA.
Totally.
That's probably like a class in itself just to manage. I can only imagine.
Death by group chats, man. Yeah. There's so many group chats.
Too many group chats. So continue on. So you spent the 3rd period in Fonty. And
I did 3rd period in Fonty. So I jump into my summer. So my summer, I spent it in London. I was working with a first-time fund, which pretty much means a fund that is starting for the first time, raising money for the first time. It was an interesting experience, but it didn't have as a lot of investment experience, more about setting up the fund, raising money, administration, accounting, lawyers. Who do we want to use? What's a structure? It was pretty interesting in that sense, but it lacked the investment experience. So that was one downside. I was there for, keep in mind, the summer period is quite short. It's 8 weeks, while U.S. schools have a 12-week or 10-week summer period. So that was my summer, but let me talk about other summer internships because these are quite, a lot of students will be interested in this. The banking internships, a lot of them are hard. They stick to the 10-week period. So those who worked at Goldman, JP, Morgan Stanley, etc., they actually left school 2 weeks early. They left P3 2 weeks before P3 ended, and they started working.
Oh, wow.
They would train back or fly back to do the final exam, but then they would go back to work. So it's a bit of an inconvenience, but in that sense, I'm happy to say no one really reported the school or professors being tough about that or being inflexible about that.
Right.
My one friend, my one flatmate and really good friend, he was at Google, and not only did he start early, he also finished late. He finished 3 weeks into the 7-week P4, that is September, October.
Right.
And that's tough because, that's tough. But then he just had to be smart about how he picked his classes, which is a good transition to electives. P3, you still have some core classes, which is what these various students have to come back for to do the exams or final group projects. But P3 is when you start doing more electives, less core. And P4, P5 is all electives. Some electives are an intense 1 week. Some electives are spread out over 7 weeks, and you do your typical 90 minutes a week, 90 minutes a class, or 2 90-minute classes a week. And some electives are actually independent study projects. So you have one class and they're meant to do all your own research. And that's what's cool about business school. I'm sure all the schools have this opportunity. You really can focus on what you're interested in, and as well as spend your time how you want to spend your time. So,
and those electives,
example,
are those electives, do students have to think about like where these electives are, right? Like maybe only Singapore is offering certain electives and then France, there's only certain electives?
Yeah, so generally speaking, they've done a good job of offering to both campuses. And the way to do it, and I guess it makes business sense, I can see how it makes business sense, is those popular electives that are taught by maybe one or two select professors or, practitioners who are coming back to teach, they don't span the entire period. They don't span the entire 8 weeks. They might be 3 weeks of intense classes in France, and then the professor will fly over to Singapore. Depending on where his home base is, he'll stay in a hotel in Singapore or an apartment, a short-term apartment, and he'll teach that class in Singapore for the second half of that period. Or I'm sure the school would love to have, sometimes they have double professors in both locations who teach the same classes. But yeah, that's generally what happens.
Okay. And then in P4, so you did the exchange, right? So
yep.
And you were at Wharton, as you mentioned. How hard was it for you to get one of those seats? I mean, I would imagine it'd be difficult.
Yep. So the three main exchange programs that Insead offers are Wharton, Kellogg, and then CEBS, which is a school in China. Out of these three, Wharton has the most, and I think this is driven by the destination school. Obviously, they have their own requirements, but Wharton has the most stringent sort of eligibility criteria. So for Wharton, let's see, there was an essay component, there was a GPA component, and oh man, the third one is slipping me right now. Oh, of course, it's the number of points you bid.
Yes.
So if you bid too low, you will lose on that third leg. And this is where it gets a bit confusing and perhaps a bit qualitative. You could be on the lower end of the bidding range, but you could have a killer essay or a killer GPA, and then you'll get it.
So, okay, explain to our listeners this bidding process, because I'm completely in the dark.
Sure. It's very similar to most schools. You have, all students have some form of capital or some form of currency. You can call it points, you can call it credit. Well, I think in Wharton, it was called something different. It can be of different ranges. But in Insead, it's called bidding points. You have 200 of them. And you have to use these points to bid for popular classes or popular exchanges. And you have to bid for these right after the core period finishes, P1, P2 finishes, and you're picking classes for P3 onwards. So you have to be careful. And it's just like a little bit of fun, a little bit of mind-numbing, annoying sort of planning you have to do, but it's very natural given there's limited seats and a lot of demand for certain classes. So we all know what classes went for in the past. We had the max, the min, the averages. We all know the ratings of the classes based on what students rated the professors in the classes before. And this forms our desires. Besides, obviously, our own career ambitions, our own personal interests, this will form your desire. And then you have to be careful of how you spend the points. Some will be spent in P3, some will be spent on P4, P5, some will be spent on the exchanges. There's one class I'm doing right now, for example. This is really interesting dynamic. It's a it's a high profile class. It's talked about a lot. It's won awards. Other schools like Wharton and Harvard have tried to get the Insead professors to bring the program over to them. It's called Your First 100 Days. I'm literally just started it. The other day I had to cancel the schedule we had because I was up till 2 a.m. on a sudden assignment. It's where you simulate how your first 100 days in a startup would be like. You've just bought a company and now you're trying to run the company. It's your first 100 days. So it's really cool that way. But without digressing too much about the class just now, you have to find 5 students and 250 points amongst the 5 students to even bid for the class.
Wow.
So what does that mean? Folks who don't do exchanges, folks who are Singy or Fonty lifers, as we call them, are very popular for this class. Everyone wants to nab one of these lifers for their team because he's going to come with 100 points. He or she is going to come with 100 points. So
that's hilarious.
It's such a game.
Sorry, yeah, it's a total.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's crazy. So I gotta say, and this is maybe another podcast in its own, but I totally like to think I played the point system. I got all the classes I wanted, and I got all the exchanges I wanted, and obviously some of that was due to luck. Yeah. So I spent all my points on my Wharton and Singapore exchange. I had 0 points coming into Singapore for P5, but luckily this team lost one member. I knew that guy. I knew one of the team members because he was in Wharton with me. And he's like, "Hey, we lost a finance guy. You know finance. Do you want to be our CFO for this for this class?" So that's how I got my team.
Boom. No, that's interesting how that works.
Yeah. So it's a bit complicated, but I hope you're kind of getting a sense of how these points work and the complexity and the sort of forward planning you got to do. When you're in P3, when you're at the end of P2, you got to think about what you want to do in P5.
Got it. Wow. No, that's great insight into the process. And so how many, roughly, do you know, how many INSEADers went to Wharton and Kellogg and Siebes?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Wharton, by the way, the exchange is offered in P4 and P5. And each of those periods have about 20 to 25 INSEAD students.
Got it.
I don't, unfortunately, know the number for Siebes, and I know Kellogg was much less. I want to venture a guess of around 10 to 15.
Okay.
Kellogg does offer one interesting difference in its exchange program to Wharton. It lets you stay there for P4 and P5, so you can go 4 straight months.
Right.
And I think this is actually quite key because one of the things I realized being in Wharton for 7-8 weeks is it's too short of a period to really get too involved in any of the clubs. I was there because I wanted to recruit in New York, which is a nearby 2-hour bus drive. I also have a lot of friends on that side, so I made it a point to visit them. Not to say that the Wharton students are tough or cold. They're all very nice. You get to know your classmates and you get to know your flatmates. In fact, my guy, Darren, he grew up in Singapore. He's very similar to me, international student at the Singapore American School, where I was at the Jakarta International School. So, we got along really well. But yeah, it's short. I just didn't do too many club activities.
Yeah.
So that's one thing Kellogg has as a benefit.
But I'd also think, as an Insead MBA, you want to maximize your time with your other Insead MBAs. So it's kind of this trade-off.
Totally.
Both sides, right?
Totally. So, and it's funny you mentioned that because I'm seeing my crew or my close friends who I left in June, and I saw some of them in the summer. They all saw each other in P4. I'm seeing photos over this damn WhatsApp group that I'm not part of. But now we're all together. Most of them are on the Singapore campus. So it's nice to see everyone again, reconnect those friendships. And then, so that I don't think I would have done the Kellogg thing, or even if Wharton offered it, I don't think I would have done that because I do want to reconnect with my INSEAD buddies and graduate with the INSEAD class and go on the INSEAD graduation trips and things like that.
Well, listen, I know I'm already over time with you, and you got a conference to finalize and 100-day assignment to get to. But let me just ask you one more question.
Yeah.
About entrepreneurship, because we hear a lot, INSEAD really markets itself as a place for entrepreneurship, but I kind of wanted to get the student perspective on it. What do you see as being the special opportunities for aspiring entrepreneurs or just entrepreneurs who already started their companies, right, at INSEAD?
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's a great question. And I'm happy to talk a little bit longer on this point because I think it's important. So, yes, INSEAD does bill itself as a school for entrepreneurs. It bills itself as having a lot of a lot of resources for entrepreneurs. I'd say the main thing is that one of the main benefits right off the bat, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're looking to become an entrepreneur, or you come in with you're maybe already working on something, or you come in with an idea, is that hopefully you'll meet a lot of cool people that want to work with you. And
Right.
that has happened for me. That has happened for me where me and some of my close buddies, and we became close buddies because we have these similar interests, have tinkered with ideas. And yes, we've only tinkered with it, but there are other people who've actually gone through and launched websites or launched platforms. And to be fair, I think this happens in a lot of schools. But that's the thing. That if you go to a top school with ambitious, very driven, ambitious people, you're going to find a lot of people who are interested in doing interesting things. So that's benefit number one. Now, the classes, there are definitely a lot of courses that are sort of geared towards how to manage a startup, how to think creatively. It's funny that there's a class for that, but it's actually a great class.
How to think creatively?
Yeah, it's not called that, but like customer insights, and there's certain sort of rules or certain sort of schools of thought as to how to interpret customers and how to sell your product to certain customers.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed those classes. It's called Customer Insights at Insead, and actually Wharton had a really cool creativity class, which I think Insead teaches as well. The funny thing is, a lot of the courses are similar, but they have totally different names. One specific example, which speaks to entrepreneurship at Insead, as well as courses being called different things. At Insead, there's a class called Realizing Entrepreneurship Potential, or Entrepreneurial Potential, so REP.
Yeah.
And the exact same thing at Wharton was entrepreneurship through acquisitions. And it's all about the search fund business model, a really interesting field. If any listeners have heard about it and want to talk more about it, they can feel free to email me. It's a very interesting up and coming sector, search funds.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, yeah, back to entrepreneurship. So there are a lot of classes that Insead has geared towards this. There's the Entrepreneurship Club. There's the IVC. It's called the Insead Venture Competition, where you actually work on an idea and you pitch it with your group mates to a panel of alumni who are now entrepreneurs or professors who teach entrepreneurship. And the winner gets some funding. So that's there. More recently, they've created an alumni fund where various alumni have put in money into a fund, and this fund is purely dedicated to support aspiring entrepreneurs who are about to graduate. This is pretty new, and unfortunately, I don't have the detail of the size of the fund or that, but I think it's in the seed level, so you can get maybe 50 grand or something like that to get going for at least a year. And so it's not bad. It's pretty good that way. The conferences, similar to the IPEC or the PEVC conference, there is an entrepreneurship conference. It happened in May, the same day actually as the IPEC conference in Fonty. Insead does a decent job of getting entrepreneurs on campus for talks as well as teaching courses. So YFCD, the class I told you about earlier, one of the two main profs is this pretty successful and interesting entrepreneur. So yeah, there's a bunch of these things, and I think they're pretty good. I will just say, to be unbiased, that it all happens within an accelerated 10 months and it can fly by. Whereas a 2-year program, maybe you have more time to work on it. I know a couple of kids at Wharton actually effectively quit Wharton after the first year to work on their ideas. And quit's the wrong word because Wharton allows you to come back within 5 years. You can leave Wharton and come back and no questions asked, resume your studies if it's within 5 years.
That's a whole nother podcast, but that's an interesting policy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, where was I going with that? So the 10-month thing is kind of quick. You gotta, hopefully if you're driven and really captured by some idea, you get to work on it pretty quick, but in 10 months, there's only so much that can be done. And then what I think Insead could really develop further is 2 specific fields when it comes to startups, especially in the tech sector. They are engineering. When I say engineering, I mean coding. You're not going to become a computer scientist out of Insead, but there's a lot of value in learning the basics and then being able to speak the language with eventual engineers you're going to hire. People have said even the way it makes you think, when you learn how to code, it makes you think in a certain way, which will be ultimately what does the customer want and how am I showing it to him or her on my app. That sort of very focused way of thinking. I'm speaking about it abstractly because I don't know it, but I've heard a lot of people tell me about it. And then lastly, so that's one sector I was talking about, the one of the two. The second one is product management. Product management is a very hot career and a very attractive career for anyone who's interested in digital tech or companies like Google, Facebook, Apple. It's you're in charge of being the liaison or the sort of middleman between executives or the sales guy or the commercial people, as well as on the other side, the engineers are building the product. How does the button look? What colors we want to use? What's the story if I want to go from making an order to actually paying with my credit card? What's efficient? Reading the data of how customers are interacting with your website or your app, and making creating some insight out of that. That's product management in a nutshell. Facebook does not. They've been very open about it. They don't look for MBAs for this role. Amazon does. So depending on the company, it's a bit tricky. But if you have that coursework at your MBA school, you already have a leg up in whatever target company for that role.
And I mean, would you say, just based on your own experience, that you see like the vast majority of your classmates are looking for corporate roles, right? First, or would you say it's a pretty healthy percentage are also looking to start their company?
It's been a continuously evolving shift towards entrepreneurship.
Interesting.
It's been very so. What was it? We've had situations where I think this maybe has been going on for a year or two now, but the investment banking talks, so the investment banking, not the conference, but like speakers who come onto campus or sort of students who are experienced in giving their history on banking to students who aspire to be bankers. These auditoriums have been less and less full when these talks happen. While the entrepreneurship conference or while the entrepreneurship talks, they're jam packed. Seats are not available, and this has been a evolving shift. So definitely, it's not the same as it was before. Banking and consulting are not as popular. Maybe perhaps also buy side and venture capital on one hand, and doing your own thing or joining an early stage startup is a lot more popular.
Wow. Because, I would think that, maybe the conferences are like really popular, right? Because everyone wants to start their own company. But then when push comes to shove and you have your student debt looking at you in the face, you want to get, that well-paying job.
For sure. You're right. You're definitely still right. I'm saying the interest on campus into how you spend your time is a lot more skewed towards these two new fields. And there's less of people who will hesitate in the way you just described. It still happens, I'm sure. I mean, student debt is a real thing to think about, and you got to be responsible about it. But I mean, if I had to just think really quickly, if I think of friends that come to mind, one is going back to consulting, one is doing his own startup, one is going to Spotify, a handful are going to Google and Facebook, and these are obviously not startups anymore, but they're doing interesting things with AI and startups within Google and Facebook. There's really only a handful of guys who are doing banking, and the consultants. Consulting is still relatively popular. Insead, but we didn't get into this, but Insead is a consulting powerhouse.
Yeah.
I talked about Wharton. I thought about Wharton being a finance powerhouse. Insead is incredible when it comes to consulting.
Yeah. Just so many opportunities, right? And so many other consulting firms coming to campus and so many students placed in consulting. Yes.
Yeah. The resources we have at our fingertips and efforts the companies put in meeting us and selling us effectively is quite incredible.
Yeah.
As an example, McKinsey came to Philadelphia strictly to have dinner, strictly with the Wharton exchange students.
Wow. Really?
Yeah, that didn't happen. Yeah, my Wharton buddy's like, what? How come I don't know about this? I'm like, sorry, it's only for Insead. So it's pretty impressive what they've done there. It's a very good school for consulting.
So, Rahul, this has been a great conversation. Any just last words of wisdom for our listeners who might be considering Insead before we end the show?
Look, it's been a whirlwind 10 months, but I really enjoyed it. What Darren didn't share earlier was I'm a lot older than most students. You might have heard from my background that I, was had a relatively successful career before this. I'm 33. But regardless, I really enjoyed the time at Insead. Being in school is a different ballgame altogether. People you meet, learning to make new friends, learning to network in different environments. I'm really happy with the way I've done the networking. I feel like I know lots of people in Europe now. So my takeaway as a relatively older student is don't let that stop you, and really enjoy yourself. It's 10 months, so live it up.
Awesome, Rahul. It's been a great conversation, one of the best ones we've done. So I really appreciate it, and get back to work, man.
Thanks, Darren. Great job with Touch MBA, and then happy to help. And let's catch up soon.
Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Don't be shy. We have a mailing list. Go to touchmba.com and get yourself signed up. And we'll keep you posted with the best tips and insider interviews on how to get into your number one school. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at Touch MBA. See you soon.